going to get started here in a minute. We're going to start the day with Shure. We're going to start with RF coordination. Criss Niemann is going to be presenting. And we'll roll through the day. Does anyone have any questions to start off? Anything in particular? Cool. So I'm going to hand this off to Chris. This is Criss Niemann from Shure. Round of applause. Let's not be bashful. All right, Chris is going to take it away. Enjoy, and yeah, here we go.
All right. Thanks, Amir. We're grateful to be here today. I hope you guys are all ready to charge out of here, becoming RF experts and go Shure go, right? Joking. I want this to be really interactive, so certainly if you have questions or anything, just raise a hand. We'll get to it throughout the presentation. And again, loose, easy going, so anytime something comes up, please feel free to jump in the middle of. So, if we can switch to the PowerPoint. I wanted to start the day talking a little bit about spectrum and just spectrum updates. You may be familiar, in the past we went through a spectrum update or what we call the DTV transition and the 700 megahertz auction. Does everybody remember that? That happened in 2008 or so. It was very painful. It was very ugly. That whole thing actually started clear back in 1997, 98, so spectrum and auctions have been something that has been a topic for Shure for a very long time, and certainly for anybody who does wireless stuff in the UHF TV band. So we want to focus on the incentive auction, which is another auction that's going to be coming up here shortly, and we'll talk about the background of that and why we're doing it, as well as a couple other topics. So, the background on this auction, why is it happening? Basically, does the FCC really have it out for us wireless mic users? And the answer is no, they don't. The last auction, we kind of felt that way. But this one, they're completely aware of wireless microphones now. All we had to do is show the picture of the president using a wireless microphone, and they all went, oh, you guys actually use those things. There's lots of them out there, and they're important to what we do. So we also want to update on TV band devices. The TV band devices are devices that were formerly known as white space devices. Those are devices that can operate in between TV channels just like wireless microphones do in the UHF spectrum. We're also going to talk about the incentive auction R and O, which is the report and order. And then the second R and O that dealt specifically with wireless microphones and licensing of wireless microphones. So with that in mind, why is this happening? Why are we going through yet another auction? The reality is that the fundamental difference between broadcast and broadband is there's a difference between the two. Broadcast is an on-air TV station, right? We can put up a set of antennas and get free TV over the air. The reality is only about 10% of Americans receive their TV that way. Most of us are plugged into Time Warner Cable or Dish Network or DTV or something else. 58% of people have one of those smartphone devices, right? And it turns out that more and more companies and medical facilities and such are actually getting you data here rather than anything that happens over the air on over-air TV stations anymore. So with this idea that more and more people are using smartphones and less people are using over-the-air TV, there turns out to be quite a bit of unused space in that UHF TV band. Realizing again that the information over broadband is more important than ever, and again, maybe you've already experienced this, healthcare, education, public services, and other key components of daily life are happening over that smartphone. So, you might say, well, UHF, let's just go somewhere else. Let's move it and operate in a different place. And you might be surprised to see that every bit of spectrum from 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz has already been spoken for. It's been allocated for something. You also might notice that there's trade-offs. The lower in frequency we go, the better penetration that we have, or distance that the RF signal can travel, but the antennas get considerably bigger. So those of you who might remember VHF, they have long antennas, whereas if we go higher in spectrum, I can get more data throughput. The antennas do get smaller and more manageable. However, it just doesn't penetrate well, and you've probably all experienced this with your Wi-Fi system in your house. Just within your house, it's hard to get good signal everywhere. But we want to focus in really on this center section, the UHF TV spectrum, which is right here. That current TV band is approximately 470 megahertz to 806 megahertz. A chunk of that we can't use. Anything above 698, of course, was out. That's what got auctioned off previously. But, yes, sir?
When that auction happened, what devices have taken over that space right now? I haven't seen where it's been allocated yet. We're already talking about it in Washington.
This is a great question. So the question was, what devices occupy the space that was previously sold off in that 700 megahertz spectrum? In that auction, Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile, most of the broadband carriers bought chunks of those pieces of spectrum to the tune of about $19 billion. So they kicked out all the TV stations, they kicked out all the wireless microphones, which are the only things working at that time in UHF spectrum. And we paved the way for Verizon and all these other guys to operate. And here in LA, I've done scans before, and we'll actually see it if we do a scan with a wideband scanner. You'll see Verizon's LTE network operating up in that 700 megahertz spot. You may actually see spots that are open, and you say, gosh, I want to go after that and use it as a wireless mic user because I've got some old wireless product. The reality is if you're caught doing that, it's actually illegal. So whoever owns that space now, or leases it, so to speak, would have the ability to take action against you for using it there. And we've seen that with Verizon. They've actually sent kind of nasty letters to churches in particular, because churches is an installed location where on Sunday morning somebody can run a scanner and see that they're operating in that space. And then they'll send them a letter and say, you must cease and desist. So, although it may look clean, you can't use it.
No, I was just more curious what actually has been filling up that space, because I haven't seen 700 show up on my phone there.
Yeah. The other thing, too, by the way, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, if you all remember after 9/11, all of the life safety crews had a hard time communicating because they were on different frequency bands. They had all these different radios from different life safety groups that couldn't communicate with each other. So part of the 2007, 2008 auction was to create space in that 700 megahertz space for what's called FirstNet, or the new life safety. So everybody can get on the same page from a life safety standpoint. That's not up and running yet. This next auction we're headed to will fund the final transition of all the public safety into that band. Cool? So, I had mentioned all the TV stations that were up in that 700 megahertz band got kicked down to the lower part. Of course, wireless mics did too. The DTV transition, because DTV stations are much more efficient in their broadcast, you can actually butt them right up close together, right next to each other. Previously, we had to have TV stations spaced further apart when they were analog. Now we can butt them right up close to each other. So that was the idea back then, is look, we're going to kick the TV stations out, we'll bunch them up together in the lower spectrum, and that's how we can define making use of creating this extra spectrum. So along with that was a creation of TV band devices, or at least the report and order back then included the ability for TV band devices to operate. Now, TV band devices, although we don't know of any currently, there are a couple of fixed stations that are out on the East Coast. But the idea behind a TV band device is that there would be a fixed transmitter somewhere, and then other companies, maybe Google and Motorola or Apple or whoever, would create devices that could operate in more of a Wi-Fi type of manner that would get their signal over the same UHF TV spectrum. So to date, we don't know of anybody building devices, and they've had that ability to operate and build devices since 2007. Based on what we're going to learn today, it's my feeling that we probably won't see any TV band devices either, because spectrum continues to go away. And as we like to say, they just aren't making any more of it. That was kind of a joke there. Sorry. As mentioned, TV band devices operating that UHF spectrum. If we can switch to the PowerPoint, please. Thanks. So you'll notice this is actually in Chicago. So we've got TV stations lined up. Currently in Chicago, TV channels 14 and 15 are reserved for public safety. And then white space devices or TV band devices could operate anywhere where there's white spaces. That happens to be where we also would operate our wireless microphones. It should be noted that after the auction of 2007, the FCC had said, we'll reserve 2 channels for wireless microphones only, and it will be the first channel above TV channel 37, which is reserved for radio astronomy, and the first channel below TV channel 37 as well. So currently today, those are reserved for wireless microphone use. However, those are going to be going away in the next auction. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as to why that would be. You should also note that here in LA and in 12 other major metropolitan areas, where we have public safety down here, there are some other rules that apply that allow wireless microphone users to operate in LA. That would be public safety operates on 14, 15, 16. Ben, does it operate on 17 as well? I think it's 14 through 16 here. Public safety is 14, 15, 16, and 20. So in LA, you actually have a couple other protected areas right now today that you can use, which is in TV channel 17 and 19. No TV band devices would be available to operate down there. So a little hedge of protection going forward for now, but wait, we'll get to the rest of the story in just a little bit. More on these TV band devices. How are these things supposed to work? Because Shure worked quite diligently with the FCC to make sure that there were functions put in place so that TV band devices wouldn't interfere with wireless microphones. So that means that these devices would need to figure out somewhere, where am I, and are there any wireless microphones on the air where I am? Enter geolocation databases. So these show what TV channels are on the air and what's reserved for wireless microphones. It's a database that is operated by currently about five different organizations. The good news is you can register your event into the database so that you can have interference-free operation. So again, if we were having an event here, for instance, and I wanted to enter my frequencies into the database, I could do that. And then anybody's TV band devices would have to operate on other channels. Great idea, right? However, there's a couple caveats. There are licensed users and there are unlicensed users. So how do you get registered? If you're an unlicensed user, by the way, is anybody here a licensed wireless microphone user? Yeah, right. Like 99% of us are not, right? We just operate. So if you're an unlicensed wireless microphone user, here's the process. You hit the FCC with a what's called Form 601, I believe, and you can petition to register your event. You need to do that 30 days in advance of your event. The FCC makes a decision whether they'll grant you permission to use that space or not. And then once they've granted you that permission, you can then go to the database and enter your event and the frequencies that you'll be using. If you are a licensed user, you skip that process and you just go straight to the database. And we like to say you need to give it at least a day or two just to make sure that it propagates throughout all the databases and any TV band devices would have a chance to actually see your event. Then you're good to go. This kind of makes sense, right? Because you don't want to show up to some big event that you're helping produce and some Joe guitar player with some garage band has reserved all the frequencies because he's playing a gig at the local coffee house, right? Here's a list of 5 of the active databases that are current. And Spectrum Bridge, Telcordia, KeyBridge, and then, of course, Google. Google kind of plays into place here because anywhere there's a searchable database, Google tends to like to be there. But I guess what's important to note is that the FCC is not managing this database. The FCC is just providing data, and they left it up to these, and there's actually supposed to be about 10 entities that would manage the database. Here's a screen capture of what Telcordia's database looks like. You could actually enter in your city or zip code or even your geolocation coordinates. And it will populate with known TV channels that are in use there, along with any public safety. This is what a capture looks like in Chicago. And it's a little bit hard to see, but there's multiple antennas that's showing right now in their actual radiation pattern. The nice thing about using this type of database is that if you do click on a certain TV channel, it will show you that propagation of their antenna through that area. So that's kind of a nice extra added feature for you. So that really all had to do with the 700 megahertz auction. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, once again?
What's done as far as enforcing these databases, and does that information get incorporated into wireless workbench? Like, would you, that piece was, like, bit of airwaves was reserved, or?
Your question is specifically related to wireless workbench and?
Databases and registering the frequencies. So I register my frequency online.
Yes.
And then someone else down the street who didn't even bother to look at this website goes ahead and just takes up that frequency. Is there any, is there any point to it?
You call the FCC police?
Look back to this in 30 days?
Exactly. You bring up a great point. I think the point or the question is, what happens when I register my microphones for my event, and I show up and I get ready to do my event, and some other guy down the street's operating on the same frequencies? The good news is we're going to get to a better answer to this question, but the short answer right now today is, yes, unfortunately, you would have claimed to ask the guy to stop using, number one. However, since most wireless systems these days are agile, you would, when you register your event, you would take a block, by the way. You'd register for like a 6 megahertz block of space. So you would move within that space to hopefully a clean channel. Make sense?
You're not registering just a specific frequency.
No, you can register blocks.
So right now, the lookup from wireless workbench doesn't factor in
It does not factor in wireless users who have registered. That's correct. However, keep in mind the whole idea of this registration process really had to do more with TV band devices and protection from TV band devices. There are no known working TV band devices today. So, on to the incentive auction. We're saying, why are we doing this? Well, again, it plays into this idea that we've got to come up with more spectrum to provide everyone with faster and better reliable wireless to their smartphone or their smart device. It also, as I had mentioned earlier, provides funding for this FirstNet, or this public safety network that's being built. And then they'll probably put the remainder of whatever's left of these back into the coffer of the government. I'm sure they'll find a place to spend it. That's kind of what government is for, is, right? Spending the money for the better of the people. As a side note, not to get confused with anything that we're talking about, but as a side note, there is currently, right now today, going on an auction of what's called the AWS-3 spectrum, and that's up in 1.7, 1.8. There's a chunk at 2.1. It's about 65 megahertz worth of spectrum that we don't play in. But what's interesting to note is that the government leaves this auction going until people quit putting bids on the space. There's no end to this AWS-3 auction that's happening right now. And right now, they're up to over $40 billion for that 65 megahertz. So you can get an idea how important it is, not only to, to us, the user, but the people who want to sell us a service, right? The Verizons, the AT&Ts, whoever. It's very important, and they're throwing down big money to get a chunk of that space. So the last one in 2007, 2008 was 19 billion. This other chunk is at 40 billion. It's really going to be interesting to me to see what happens to our incentive auction, which will be in the 600 megahertz space. So moving forward, how is this thing going to work? Because remember, the 700 megahertz, we had to dump TV stations out. Everybody had to get out. By the way, they gave us 6 months. The FCC gave us wireless mic users 6 months to get out of that spectrum. Painful, ugly, we all felt it. This time around, as I had mentioned previously again, they're more aware and they're working with us, and we're grateful for that. But it starts with TV stations being willing to go dark or share space with other TV stations. You may know that a DTV broadcast, which is about 6 megahertz wide, it is exactly 6 megahertz wide, can operate at 1080p, surround sound, all this stuff in that one chunk. But if you start to chip away at that, you could actually have 6 TV stations operating. That's why you'll see TV tuners now. It'll tune to 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, etc. So I could have up to 6 low-quality TV stations packed into that same space as well. So again, TV stations either need to go dark, or they need to say we're going to split some spectrum with somebody else, or they might say we don't want to participate at all. But the idea is if they do go dark or if they want to share space, they name their price. They say for X hundreds of millions of dollars, we will turn our broadcast off the over-air broadcast. So the FCC takes notes of everybody, TV stations, what we're going to do, how much we're going to collect there. Then there's the forward auction. That's where the Verizons and the Sprints and the AT&Ts and T-Mobiles, all those guys come into play. And they bid on that open spectrum that the FCC knows they're going to have, because they've, the TV stations have said we're going to go dark or share space. And then once that's happened, they collect all the money. There will be a repacking, just like we did at 700 megahertz. We'll kick out the TV stations. They'll go lower in the band. There'll be transition for wireless mic users, all that. The good news is this repacking transition is going to be 39 months, not 6, 39 months. There is a possibility that some guys could light up earlier, turn their transmits on earlier, but probably not likely. So the next question is, how much spectrum and which spectrum? And of course, when is this all going to happen? In the back, yes, sir.
So when they take away some of the spectrum, what happens to the legacy product that's been out there for somebody that already owns? I know you're laughing because I'd imagine that really creates a problem.
Yeah. You bring up a great question that actually I usually never recommend getting lawyers involved. I hope there's no lawyers in the room. But that potentially could be a really big deal, because if the government says all of a sudden that I have legacy product, but they say I can't use it anymore, there's probably got to be some retribution there, or maybe a tax write-off or something to disable that unit and say I'm not using it anymore. The reality is, I don't have an answer to your question, but I would agree that there's probably something there for wireless mic users in the future to think about from a government standpoint.
Yeah, let me, I don't want to pin you on this one, but so I'm talking about from an end user standpoint. So somebody owns a system. Can they continue to use it? I know you can't continue to sell into that spectrum, but can they continue to use it? Or is somebody going to go up to them some Sunday afternoon in their church and say, turn this off because you got to buy a new one?
Yeah, so the reality is once the transition has happened, yes, the rightful leasee of that spectrum now can send you a cease and desist letter, and if you don't stop, then at some point they will have the ability to, take you to court on it or slap a list. The FCC doesn't have police. That was my joke earlier. What's going to happen? They're going to send the FCC police after you? They're a governing body that sits in D.C. That's it. But because of the laws and the way they're written, again, a Verizon or Sprint or whoever owns that would have the ability to write a letter and then pursue legal action if you did not cease and desist. That R&O, the report and order, was approved in May of this year. That was already delayed. Sorry to keep jumping back and forth here, but you may remember we started the DTV transition in 1997, and it didn't come complete until 2008. These things tend to get delayed and have issues. We are already seeing that with this next incentive auction. It was approved in 2014. We were supposed to start having auctions even this year. That was delayed until next year, and now just recently it got delayed until 2016. So that's when it would begin. The auction would begin then, and then once the auction closed, you would have 39 months to transition for this repacking period. What does that mean to us wireless mic users? We're looking at 4 or 5 years before our current wireless products in those bands may have issues. What do those auctions look like? It's kind of gray and murky right now because we don't know how many TV stations are going to be willing to give up their on-air spectrum. Again, it's called the incentive auction. We're hoping, well, not we, but I think the FCC is hoping that lots of broadcast TV stations will go off the air. What this would look like would be, you'll see, maybe everyone can see this, there's actually pairs starting at the high end. This is 698 megahertz headed down. So this version up here, and these are versions of what it might look like from the FCC. This first version here would be a complete failure of this auction, right? They didn't hardly sell anything, and it's unlikely that that will happen. But you get the idea. There's an uplink and a downlink, and they need to be separated by some amount of space. If we look here, all the way at the bottom, you'll notice that it could push all the way down into, this is the low 500s. This is not likely, although it could happen. It's not likely. That'd be lots and lots and lots of TV stations giving up their on-air space. The reality is it's probably going to be somewhere here in the middle. So let's kind of hone in on what some of these things look like. I was having some help there. If we look at this example, you'll notice that there's this gap, this duplex gap in between. Again, that's just a space separating the uplink and the downlink. We know that the FCC wants to allow wireless microphones to operate there, but we don't know if they'll allow anything else to operate in that space. We'll probably get another report and order maybe this time by next year further defining exactly who and how they can operate in that duplex band. But the good news is that's in that 600 megahertz space. So if you have 600 megahertz equipment, you don't want to run right out right now and sell it and get rid of it or panic or anything. It's possible that your equipment still will work if it winds up landing in this duplex gap. There's also guard bands that sit around TV channel 37. If you remember, I mentioned 37 is the radio astronomy channel. These guard bands are reserved for wireless microphones, as well as the guard band potentially at the end. This would be a scenario where the auction would take spectrum down past TV channel 37. There would have to be a guard band separating it from other TV channels. That doesn't happen here because it stops before TV channel 37. This space, guard bands would be fair game for wireless microphones as well. There's yet another potential here with TV channel 37. There is considerations about, from the FCC saying, you know, radio astronomy only happens in certain places. It's fairly local. Maybe wireless microphones should be able to operate in that space as well. So there's still a lot of things yet to be decided. And here is the new hierarchy for licensing. So this is the second half of what we talked about earlier. The FCC and, of course, Shure and other wireless manufacturers and end users have lobbied to, you know, gain more interest from the FCC. And this really helps a lot because they are, like I said, they're aware now of us unlicensed users, and they've kind of granted us all blanket amnesty because nobody, previous to 2008, we were all actually operating illegally if we didn't have a license. So after they found out how many people were operating and working, they said, everybody's got amnesty if you're using a wireless microphone. You're just an unlicensed user. And we have a question.
One of the internet discussions is followed the FCC twice and listed off the device, you know, one of the wireless ones we had. The lady here had asked me what it was, you know, the licensing for that. And I'm like, what brings it the multiple, you know, we're using 30 or 40 or something like that. But she was very insistent that we weren't needing licensing for that. And even when I'm pushing her on it, she didn't give me anywhere to go.
Yeah.
This mythical license, which I assume comes with a badge and a hat or something, right?
Yeah. And this was, who was this again?
Oh, directly FCC.
Okay. So the point is, he had went directly to the FCC and said, we've got these microphones, we want to become a licensed user, and whoever you contacted the FCC was saying, you don't have to do that.
Twice, and I read
Twice, yeah.
there's a, whatever the bottom is on the tag, you've got some kind of a schedule that's
Yes.
operating under, and I gave them that information, and they were like, we don't need it.
Yeah.
Even though I was pushing on it, what I've been reading said I should have one, have the ability to get one.
So this brings up yet another opportunity to contact a lawyer. The reality is navigating the FCC is treacherous and wild waters, and if you work with somebody who understands FCC speak and all of the R&Os and laws that they've written and created, you can navigate those waters. Form 601 is the one that you want to start with. That's the gateway form. But I guess it's probably a good idea to keep rolling here because it will come to your point. We expanded that licensing eligibility now. I don't know when you talked with the FCC. Okay. So now you have expanded ability to register and license your equipment. So as mentioned before, we can all still continue to operate the way we always have been. We have blanket amnesty now. We don't need a license to operate. However, we're going to talk in just a little bit about who now has the ability to get a license. And then, of course, the FCC does commit to further proceedings for additional spectrum. Again, that's the idea of looking in other places where we can operate legally. So, wireless mic license eligibility. These guys have had the ability to register their mics since there were wireless mics. Broadcasters, educational TV, cable networks, TV news production, etc. And they just have a license, and it doesn't matter how many channels they had to operate or where. They just had a license to operate a low-power RF station. And wherever they went, they had their piece of paper and, kind of said, we're the kings, and you guys have to deal with us. Well, now, venues and sound companies who regularly use 50 or more channels can register for a license. So theaters, big houses of worship, convention centers, theme parks, educational centers, government locations, and keep in mind this could be ears, comms, actual wireless microphones. It's anything wireless audio related that happens in that UHF TV spectrum. The interesting part here too is that they're venues, but there's also sound companies. So this is really good news for production companies or sound companies, because if I've got piles of racks sitting around of wireless and I'm going to go to this church and then I'm going to go to that theater and then I'm at this outdoor live event or something, your license goes with you wherever you go. What if I'm a church that uses regularly 8, 10 channels of wireless, so I'm not really able to register for a license, but I do a Christmas and an Easter production or something like that, where I do bring in that many? It might be to my benefit as a church to hire a sound company who is licensed and brings in all their gear. So maybe you see benefit here, if those of you that are in the production world, of applying for the license. That said, as I mentioned earlier, it's not going to be no breeze. The FCC will scrutinize and look, and it may be some rough going to get the license, but there's incentive there to do it. So kind of the last wrapping points here on spectrum update. Here's what we know. The spectrum below 600 megahertz is going to become more crowded. Some spectrum will still be available in 600 megahertz. And users will still be able to reserve open TV channels, access that database. Because even, like I said, right now today, all those TV band devices could be operating, there just aren't any. What we don't know is exact amount of spectrum that'll be auctioned off, what specific rules might govern that duplex gap, meaning is it just wireless mics or can other things operate in that space? And then of course what additional spectrum might become available for us to use. Finally, what do you do? Well, at this point, don't panic. Any 600 megahertz stuff you have, like we talked about, is going to be viable for the next 4 to 5 years without changing anything. It may be viable past that. If you've got a wide tuning band receiver and spectrally efficient wireless systems, you'll be able to dance around and move to that duplex gap or to guard bands and get up and operating. Also, you can consider separate or alternative frequency bands. So Shure actually makes products that operate in 2.4, 1.9, which is called the decked band. We make wireless product that operates up in 900 megahertz. The problem is that all of those spaces have special defined regulations on them. So if I'm a professional production company and I'm going into a convention center that has a lot of 2.4, I probably wouldn't want to buy a 2.4 wireless. It might not work so well. And I certainly wouldn't want to try to put 10 of them in. One might work in a real high RF 2.4 environment. Our 1.9 system in the decked band has inherent delay because that's required to operate in that band. So if you're doing a performance where somebody's singing, that much delay probably would not be appropriate. However, if you're providing audio for a conference where it's spoken word, no problem. Finally, don't throw away your 600 megahertz equipment. That kind of goes without saying at this point, I think. And if you're using 700 megahertz mics, stop. It's illegal. You need to move out. Probably can't say that enough. I'll show this slide a couple more times before we move on, but just so you know, we do offer technical training at Shure. You can email questions about training events at that email address. We have technical support available at that number and also at that email. And of course, you can go to Shure and subscribe to our webinars. Okay, the technical training email address is training_us@shure.com. Technical support is support@shure.com. And the phone number for technical support, this is great because you'll get right to the guys who can help you. 847-600-8440. And if you go to our website, specifically shure.com/training, you can see all kinds of information there listed about the training. And we also archive our webinars, so you can actually go back in time. You can look at other webinars that we've done throughout the years. Cool. Any other further questions on Spectrum update? What happened? What's going to happen? Anything? Cool.
All right, cool. So we're gonna take a quick about 5-minute break just because we started a little late. So we want to try to make up some time. So if you guys want to get up and stretch, use the restroom, whatever, grab a snack, go for it. We're going to get right back to the second part of the short seminar here shortly. And then for the gear in the back, just ask questions to the guys around here. On the Shure stuff, we do have in-ear demos. If anybody wants to hear any of the SE earphones, I have demos for that, as well as all the K series and stuff back here is all hooked up, so we can play anything you see. Thanks a lot.